So I'll talk a little bit about how I became involved really in work in Africa, a bit about how our link developed, a bit about what we've achieved, some of the frustrations and such like, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit about the research and we'll see how we go with that. I've got to apologise for being a doctor, I think, because in my group this afternoon, someone said, well, why are they all doctors that are talking and not other people? So I'm often on a very stick to start off with because I am a doctor, so sorry about that. I'm going to show you 4 different people at the start, and we're going to come back and tell you about them later on. This guy here, the chap in the middle here, these kids here, this girl, and this chap here. All right? And all of them you'll hear about later on, and you'll see why. So, where I first started working in Africa was actually in the Gambia. This is the Royal Victoria Hospital in Banjul, and I was fresh out of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, learned all about infectious diseases, malaria, everything else. On my first ward round in the Gambia, I came across 4 patients who'd had a stroke, and they were all quite young, and I thought, that's interesting, I wasn't expecting this. Looked at the literature, there wasn't very much, so basically that's how it started. I got involved with looking at stroke research. And what we did was, I decided to do, well, let's do a stroke follow-up study. And being a bit naive, I'd just come from the UK, I thought this must be very easy. I'd never done research before, never mind research in Africa before. So I thought, well, what do we do when someone has a stroke? We do a CT scan. Well, the nearest CT scanner was in Tenerife. That's quite a long way on a boat. All the usual issues, and again, you're all familiar with this, the problems with access to blood tests, access to electricity and such like. And then when I said to people that I was going to follow these people up to see what happened to them, because no one had ever done that before in relation to stroke in Africa, people said, well, it's ridiculous, Richard, you'll never find these people. Because you don't have addresses, you don't have phone numbers or anything like that. But you've just got to be persistent. And don't go on the colour of the door, because they keep changing the colour. What you really need, and what the beauty about research in Africa is, if you've got a relative, you'll find the patient. Because of the extended family and such like. So we did that study. We followed these patients up to about 3 years after they left hospital. And what we found was that stroke was a big problem, that patients didn't do particularly well after they left hospital. But what led that left, and one of the things that came out of it was there were twice as many men as there were women. So I thought, that's strange. Why are there more men than women having strokes? And of course, I then started to think, well, actually, who actually gets to hospital in Africa? And how representative are they of the whole population? So now, we're going to travel across to Tanzania in East Africa. And this is Kilimanjaro. The building at the bottom is KCMC. And the reason we're going to Tanzania is because on the slopes of Kilimanjaro, at that stage, we had a population of 141,000 people. We knew the name and age and sex of everyone in that population. It was a demographic surveillance site. So what we then did within that site was, so there's a bit of a background about Tanzania. That should actually read 37 million, a very representative sub-Saharan African country. And this is where, whoops, there we are. There you are. I don't even have to use the pointer because you've got a pointer there. But this is where we are, up in the north of Tanzania, next to Kilimanjaro, is where we're doing the research. So, what we did was, we did a house-to-house survey of 140,000 people, 30,000 households, and we asked these 3 questions. Now, this is my second learning point when you do research in Africa. You've got to explain to people what you're looking for, because these questions were asked before I'd even set foot in Tanzania. And the first thing I had to do when we arrived in Dar es Salaam was to actually hand sort through 30,000 forms to find the positive responders. And on the 3rd day, we suddenly got very excited because there was a village high up the mountain where there were loads of positive responders. So, fantastic. High altitude must be a risk factor for stroke. But no, it wasn't, because then we looked at the age of the people who were responding, and they were all aged 1, at age 2, at age 3. But they all needed help with their dressing and their eating and everything else. So you've really got to explain to me what you're looking for, otherwise you'll get exactly what you've asked. All right. So we did find what we were looking for, and this still remains the largest ever prevalent study of stroke in Africa. And what we found was that actually it was probably about half as common if you compared it age standardized to a Western population. But there were fairly similar numbers of men and women. So if you go out in the community, actually the men and women, it's a relatively equal thing. And then one thing here, which is just, you know, in the UK, you're not allowed to get to the age of 40 without having your blood pressure measured. But in Africa, the first time you know you've got high blood pressure is when you have a stroke, probably. So here we are. Here's our first guy. Here he is. He's had a stroke. He answered to our questions. So we saw him, the stroke prevalence study. He doesn't need to go to a nursing home or residential home because he's got this fantastic extended family around him to look after him, this grandson who actually is responsible for him. But I said that those questions found children. Here were some other children that it found. Towards the end of the study, we'd been all over the mountain, and then we got to one of the lowland villages, and suddenly all these children came out of the woodwork. And it was most bizarre because in the village it was quite spread out, and no one had realised quite what a big problem it was until they all came together one day. And so, of course, this wasn't like what I was looking at, but I thought, well, this is very strange. I haven't a clue what this is. I'd certainly never seen anything like it before. But the clue really was this, that all of them had quite dark staining of their teeth. And in fact, when you looked at the well water that they were all drinking, it was that much fluoride. Now, in the northeast of the UK, we add fluoride to water. But actually, if you've got too much, which that is far too much, then it causes these problems. And WHO say you shouldn't have more than 1.5. So it was about 15 times what WHO recommend in the well water. And this was really sad because these kids were then kind of disabled for life purely because of the water that they were drinking. You can either get, it depends when you get it, but you either get the sort of bow legs or you get the knock knees variety, because when they weight bear, the bones are too weak to take their weight. And this is the standard teeth fluorosis problem that you get. If you go in Africa and you go to an area that has a lot of fluorosis, you will see a big beaming smile, and you'll see these big beaming smiles like this, because it is ubiquitous within that local population. But that was fine, because actually we got in touch with the water engineering company locally, and they put in pipe water. Problem solved, and there we go. In that village, to this day, there's been no more cases of that problem, because they've now got pipe water. And when I speak to the students, I always give this as a perfect example of finding a problem, finding what's causing it, and actually being able to solve it. But it doesn't always work like that, because a few years later, in another couple of villages, they suddenly said, well, you know, we're getting the same problem again, what's going on? So I said, well, the first thing you need to do is measure the well water. And what we did was we measured the well water that was the original village here. This is about Kilimanjaro up here. This is about Meru. And where the redder it is, the higher the fluoride is. We developed a link with an engineering school, and an engineer did a PhD on this. And what he looked at was the different well water. And the areas where it was a new problem was here. And it was phenomenally high fluoride levels. These kids were going to school. They were using this well. It had 30 parts per million of fluoride. The rice was being cooked in it and everything else. So they were going to school, and the problem was getting worse. So at that time, we couldn't get the well water, the piped water down to that village. So then what we have to then do is you have to find a retired professor of fluoride from Denmark. This is him here, Eli Dahi. And basically, he's Mr. World Authority. And what he does is he puts a load of animal bones into a kiln, heats them up for 4 days, and then at the end of that 4 days, you end up with bone char, which you then put in this filter, run the water through, that absorbs the fluoride, and you've got water that doesn't taste very nice, but it hasn't got any fluoride in it. And what can you do for the people who've already got the problem? Well, you develop a link with another hospital that actually can operate on these people and straighten their legs. So this is a before and after of one of the children. And then what that led to was actually, I'm involved with I'm a chair of a charity which links primary schools in the northeast of the UK with Africa. And this was a fantastic project because I was able to go and talk to the school in the UK and say, look, we've got this problem. They could see all these kids and identify with it. And it's all to do with global citizenship on the school curriculum. And it's fantastic because it's not just imagining stuff, it's actually seeing these kids. But then the headmaster had the really bright idea of giving me a whole load of letters and then asking me to try and get this photograph here. Believe me, this took a very long time. I think it took a long time in the UK, but in Africa it took even longer. But we eventually got the spelling right. So this was the school that they were linked with. So all of those things kind of put me in touch with loads of people at KCMC, which was the local referral hospital. And really that's how I got to know people from medical records, from pediatrics, from medicine and everything else. And so this is KCMC, the local big referral hospital. And what happened was I went to our chief executive in 1999. I said, you know, don't you think we should be doing something for developing countries? And in those days, there weren't many links around. This was a relatively new type of thing. But we got funding. Did a visit in 1999. We got funding from the British Council in those days. And it's continued since then. And a lot of that you've heard from Brenda this morning. It's been a struggle at times. It's been a big struggle at times, but we've managed to keep going and done various things. And you've got to have agreement at the highest level. So this is the chief executive of KCMC. So he came over to Northumbria. He met all the big wigs, and he also met me. But he met our chief executive, and so there was an understanding at the top level between the trusts. And just to pick up on one or two things, and I'll go through these relatively quickly, because some of these Brenda's already mentioned to you, but she mentioned Helen Boone to you, who, when we first went out there was a huge problem with wounds that wouldn't heal up, and all of the wards were full of people with wounds from the surgical and medical wards, where the patients end up in hospital for months because they just didn't get their wounds healed. So there's obviously a big problem that they identified. So we brought 2 nurses over to the UK, and of course, wound dressings in the UK are incredibly expensive, but actually honey is really good. So one of the things they developed was they've got some beehives now, so they use honey. The other things they were really interested in was maggots. So maggots actually get used in the UK for treating wounds, but also we thought, well, actually this might be quite a cost-effective solution in East Africa, but the problem is you can't start introducing non-indigenous species to different parts of the world. So we then had to find an entomologist who could then find us a local larvae, a maggot that would do the job. So, you know, you've got to think outside the box. You start off with one problem, and then you think, oh, I haven't thought about that. And again, they developed a maggot farm out there, which they use. And maggots are fantastic because they're not interested in living tissue, they just eat dead tissue. So you stick them on a wound and they get rid of all the horrible stuff and they leave it nice and clean. We were also involved with occupational therapy. So the occupational therapy school had just started when we were there. It's the only school in Tanzania. So they having, and I think this is one of the things that came up this morning, being linked with us was a great credibility for them. Because these outside doctors were linked with occupational therapy. And before that, people at KCMC were saying, well, what's occupational therapy? So it helped to raise their profile. And this is one of the ones where we actually provided the teaching materials, and then after 3 or 4 years, they were independent and ran things themselves. Clinical coding. And so the problem here was that they were using a coding system which was ICD-9, which was invented in 1979, before HIV really came along. So they were coding, and they didn't actually have the classification for HIV-related illnesses. So we taught them how to use ICD-10, which is the current classification, so they're comparable to other parts of the world. And they have since become the trainers for the rest of Tanzania, but they've also trained other people in East Africa about ICD-10. So it's a really, really good example of how we provide the training, we trained the trainers, and now they're training other people. So that worked really well. And that was Linda Gibbs here who led that.